So we're going to start first by looking at the Arctic. It's a perfect day to do this because it is Earth Day, and as many of you know, the Arctic is under severe stress. And in fact, most of the Arctic nations, the member states of the Arctic Council, would agree that the number one security issue for the Arctic is actually climate change. At the moment, we are seeing unprecedented sea ice loss, and this sea ice loss is causing a habitat loss for a number of ice-dependent species such as polar bears, narwhals, walruses. But it's also completely necessary for a number of smaller species like bacteria, microorganisms that are part of the food chain. Now, as this is happening, as the sea ice is melting, there is increased international interest in the economic potential for the Arctic. So there's a number of areas, but the number one really at the moment is shipping. And that's because we already have a situation with security issues with the Suez Canal. It's very difficult for a lot of shippers to get the insurance to go through that area, so they have to go around the Horn of Africa, which is very expensive and uses a lot of fuel. So China in particular is interested in the idea of going through the Arctic to get to Europe. China is the number one shipping nation in the world. So that shipping would come with it a lot of pollution, particularly with black carbon. But there's also risk of oil spills, and there's noise pollution, which is very detrimental to a number of marine species such as whales. There's also a lot of interest in oil and gas exploration. So a number of states, particularly Russia, are interested in tapping into the gas reserves and oil reserves that are underneath the seafloor. But you've probably also heard that there's a lot of interest in deep seabed mining in that area, particularly with Norway. So Norway, within its exclusive economic zone, was starting to put forward the plans for putting out contracts to mine a 200,000 square kilometer area, so larger than all of the United Kingdom. Now that's currently on pause. They just paused that in December, but they're going to revisit it again in September. And there is a lot of environmental issues that are associated with that. And then finally, there is a real interest in tourism of the Arctic, including last chance tourism, which you've probably heard about, visiting places before they're gone forever. So I've used this picture here, and I realize it's from 2016, but it still shows the main issue. So you have your high maximum ice time, which is at the end of winter, usually March, and you can see it's completely ice covered and impassable. But what we see over on the right is that at the low point, the minimum, there is actually ways to get through the Northeast Passage by Russia and the Northwest Passage. Now, I was just reading actually a scientific article this morning that is talking about this area here is part of like the last ice area. We're going to talk about that more. That is the area, a large part of that, that is going to remain ice covered longer than the rest of the Arctic. But recent scientific studies have just said that when the Central Arctic Ocean is basically ice-free, which means that it's less than 1 million square kilometers of ice, the last ice area will completely disintegrate within 6 to 23 years because it's just too unstable. So what we're looking at is it's quite possible by 2100 that the Arctic would be ice-free. So we're going to take a step back and look at Arctic governance because this is important. If we imagine that there's a number of countries, particularly the Arctic states, but some key non-Arctic states are interested in the economic potential of the Arctic, then we have to look at how it's being governed. And so since 1996, we have had the Arctic Council, so almost 30 years. It was created through the Ottawa Declaration, but it is just a high-level forum, and that's because the United States in particular did not want to be bound by any regulations or an organization that was going to put into force hard law. So it's mainly there for the purpose of dealing with environmental issues and sustainable development. And it's key in the Ottawa Declaration. It says that no military security issues can be addressed by the Arctic Council. And it is a completely consensus-based organization. It's made up of 8 member states, which are Canada, the United States, Russia, Denmark, so Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And they have a rotating chairmanship or chairship that changes every 2 years. So currently it's Norway, but in May it's going to transfer over to Denmark, Greenland. There are 5 coastal Arctic states, and those are Canada, United States, Russia, Denmark, and Norway. Now there are also, and this is very unique for the Arctic Council, it has 6 permanent participants. Now there could only be 6 because the United States again said that they did not want more permanent participants than there were member states, because they wanted to ensure that most of the power was within the member states. And these represent indigenous groups across the Arctic. And so they really have a voice in the way things are managed in the Arctic. And then finally, you have the observers. These are non-Arctic states, non-governmental organizations, and also intergovernmental organizations such as the EU. Now, what's key here is that they don't have a lot of power. So for instance, if there's going to be a scientific study, an observer cannot finance that more than a member state. They always have to be below in status to the member state. They also can't set the agenda, and they're only there really at the invitation of the chair and the member states. So if they in any way violate some of the principles, they will be asked to leave. Okay, so the power of the Arctic Council is really their science and the reports that they put out there. These are the working groups that are part of the Arctic Council, and they come out with a number of very important reports. And one of those, for instance, was the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, and that was in 2005. And that's when the global community really started to understand the impacts of climate change on the Arctic. The fact that the Arctic is warming much faster than other regions in the world, and what the impacts of that are on a global scale. So they're very much involved in scientific research and information sharing. There's a lot of collaboration and cooperation between the different states. And they'll identify key critical issues that need to be addressed, and then create scientific groups to deal with that. And key to that would have been the Polar Code. So in 2013, the Arctic Council was very instrumental in putting forth the scientific reports that created the Polar Code that was enforced, which is hard law by the International Maritime Organization, and it sets standards for shipping in the Arctic. Another key point is the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, and this is a really special agreement, I think, because it's entirely precautionary. So there is currently no fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean because, as you can see, it's covered in ice. But the Arctic coastal states, well, all the Arctic member states, and some key non-Arctic states, which include China, the EU, Japan, so key fishing states, came to agreement for a 16-year moratorium on fishing in that area, during which time they will put together scientific reports to determine what would be appropriate catch limits. The purpose for that is usually we get in environmental law, it's very reactionary, the damage happens, then we write the laws. In this case, they're trying to make sure that the damage doesn't happen in the first place. But the Arctic Council currently is dealing with a lot of rocky relationships. So the Arctic Council is kind of interesting because it came out right after the Cold War, and of course there's still some suspicion and tension there. But they've actually been nominated multiple times for Nobel Peace Prizes because they've been able to bring together the different nations to have dialogue and create these scientific reports. And that's even when there was a lot of stress happening in other places of the globe, so particularly the Crimea crisis and the Syrian war. Even as that was happening, the different member states were able to come together to create that Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement I was talking about. Now, that did cause some tension, but mainly they could, sideline that so they could still deal with other issues. That's becoming more difficult to do. So in 2018, China released its Arctic White Paper, and in that paper, it called itself a near Arctic state and was basically advocating for more global governance of the Arctic. The argument is that the Arctic is a global environmental issue because of climate change, that all countries are affected by the fact that there is melting ice in the Arctic, and so therefore they should have more say than they currently get as an observer to the Arctic Council. Of course, this was not well received by a number of the Arctic member states, particularly the United States, Canada, and Russia. So there's a lot of suspicion for what their actual intentions are in that area. Then in 2019, there was the ministerial conference, and that's when the senior Arctic officials will get together. They'll set forth the policies for the next 2 years, and the transfer of the chairship happens. And they will always do a ministerial declaration. But in that year, it did not happen. And the reason why was because the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, number one, he did a speech just the day before, and he made a number of very inflammatory statements towards China and Russia and questioned their motives in the Arctic. But also, the United States would not sign any declaration that mentioned the words climate change. So therefore, there was no ministerial declaration that year. But most important was that in February 2022, this is just 1 week after the Arctic Council was again nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, Russia invaded Ukraine. And then in March 2022, the other Arctic member states paused and suspended all work of the Arctic Council and all the work of the working group, so all the scientific work that was being carried out. The real problem was that Russia was the chair at that time, so it was uncertain how they could even do the work, but how could they then transfer the chairship over to Norway in May 2023? So there was a lot of question with whether this would be the end of the Arctic Council. They were actually able to transfer the chairship over. Any work with Russia did not happen at that time, and Russia was looking to other partners to do their work with, feeling very isolated. The transfer happened completely via Zoom, and there were no high-level ministers involved. There still have not been any high-level meetings with ministers in the Arctic Council. And then most recently, tensions are increased because President Trump has made his statements about Greenland and Canada, both of which are Arctic Council member states and also NATO member states. So I took these screenshots. These were back from 2022, where you can see that they took down the website and said that it's pausing all official meetings. And this continued on for quite a long time. So Norway now is going to be passing on the chairship and has spent the last 2 years just trying to bring the member states back together. Now, because of this, there has been some questions still. I mean, it's getting better, but how much longer can the Arctic Council stay in its current situation with the tense relationship between Russia and the other states? So China has said already that if the Arctic Council does not include Russia, which at one point they had considered, well, do we remove Russia? China said it won't support that. And Russia's position has been that if it continues to be excluded, it will look elsewhere. So we could end up with 2 blocks working in the Arctic. Russia has already been turning to what it considers friendly states, which again are China, India, and some others, to do their work. But Russia has also made very clear that it wants to work on scientific projects. And so when we get to this point with the Arctic security concerns is that we've had the expansion of NATO since the invasion of Ukraine. So now this means that of the 8 Arctic member states, the only one that's not a member of NATO is Russia. This, of course, makes Russia very suspicious and feels isolated. It has been building up its military in the Arctic and expanding its naval bases. We also have the situation of the United States making threats against Greenland and Canada, which are NATO states, so we don't know where that's going to go. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's the Chinese white paper, being a near Arctic state. And the Canadian government and CSIS have both issued warnings to people living in the Arctic because they have concerns about Chinese involvement in the Arctic. And there has been some submarines going through that area. So moving forward, how can we keep the Arctic as an area of peace? I would say first that we need to save the Arctic Council and keep that together, because at a time when we most need scientific studies and cooperation to deal with environmental issues and sustainable development, it would be a real tragedy to lose this regional forum, which brings together the different states, even if they have differing policies, that they can still meet with this forum A lot of the diplomats and scientists that work within the Arctic councils attribute the best thing about the Arctic Council is its science, but it's also the fact that science is supposed to be non-competitive and sort of a safe area to talk. And so when they get involved in some scientific studies or development studies, they can sometimes on the side talk about security issues as well. So even though they're not technically supposed to talk about security and the military, it still provides a safe area to talk about those things because it is dealing with soft law only. So there is this opportunity for science diplomacy. At the moment, we are losing out on huge amounts of scientific data coming from Russia because the scientists are not allowed to share their information and they can't travel. They can't get their work permits, they can't get the visas that they need. So scientists in this area have said that we are going to be decades behind in our climate research because Russia makes up about half the area of the Arctic. But to also move forward, because we have this pressure by China and India and other states that want to get involved in Arctic issues, we do have to include key players. I mean, the 5 coastal states in particular they very much guard their position within the Arctic, but there needs to be some inclusion of the other states, otherwise any policies are not going to be successful. And we've already seen them move towards that with the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. But I think we could go a step farther and have a high seas marine protected area. So just to give a quick idea of what we're talking about, this is the Central Arctic Ocean. So under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, all these states have an exclusive economic zone that goes 200 nautical miles out from their coastline. And this is what we end with, that is the high seas. However, the states can make claims onto their continental shelf, which would go out 350 nautical miles. And we have a situation here because, of course, the Arctic Ocean is surrounded by the 5 coastal states, and so you're obviously going to have overlapping claims. So Norway has already put forward their claim to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and theirs has been accepted, and there is no conflicting claims with their claim. But Russia, Greenland, and Canada, as you can see from the overlap, all have some conflicting areas. Russia put forward its claim to the CLCS and it has been approved, but that does not mean that they can then start exploiting the resources and the gas on their seabed floor because of these conflicting claims by the other countries. The CLCS can accept what has been put forward for the science, but it can't actually delineate what those borders will be. What it has to do is then approve the one that's from Greenland and then approve Canada's, and then those 3 countries will have to diplomatically talk to each other to determine what those limits will be. Denmark, Greenland's is not going to probably be dealt with until 2032, and Canada's is going to take even longer. And remember, we're kind of on a time crunch here because it's all melting. And then the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which makes it a little more complicated regarding making a claim. The red dot there you can see is the North Pole. That's important because in 2007, the Russians went down in a submarine and planted a flag on the North Pole, the Russian flag, and that caused a lot of alarm internationally. So why was there not a high seas marine protected area in that area before? I mean, besides the fact that it's ice covered. Well, it's because there was, until recently, no tools to actually create a high seas marine protected area. It wasn't possible under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But in March 2023, they finally came to an agreement for the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, which I'm just going to call the High Seas Treaty. And it applies only to areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, I'm going to go back to this map. If all these claims go through and through diplomacy, they can determine who or which country owns which area, just those little white areas will be high seas. So that means that the High Seas Treaty will only apply to those 2 white areas. But the important thing for the High Seas Treaty is that it has provisions for area-based management tools. There's a number of different tools, but the most important one here is for marine protected areas. And it has another number of provisions for how we can start creating these high seas marine protected areas to protect very special parts of the ocean. And what's also key about the High Seas Treaty is that it defers to pre-existing regional and sectoral bodies. And this is important because of the way the Arctic Council has very much a very prominent position in the Arctic. So why would we want one there is because the Arctic, as I said, is a very unique and fragile environment. It has a number of endangered species, and we know that its habitat is being lost because the habitat is ice. It is undergoing a number of stressors, including the pollution, noise pollution, and the different economic activities that could be taking place there soon. So what we would like to see is a precautionary approach, again, to start protecting the area before the damage has already happened. And a high seas marine protected area also offers opportunities for more scientific cooperation between the different states. And I could see it as being a peace park, one area of the Arctic where it could be separated off, that they could protect and work together in the spirit of the Arctic Council. The reason why we would want to work with the Arctic Council, again, is because those 5 coastal states in particular exert a lot of influence over that area, and no high seas marine protected area in that zone would be successful without the inclusion of those 5 states, so they have to be involved. But through the process of creating this high seas marine protected area, you need to have a lot of scientific data. Well, the Arctic Council has already done much of that data. The only reason why they didn't create the marine protected areas before was because it was seen as a national issue, because it could only happen within their exclusive economic zones. They have this history of cooperation. They already have the Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement, which covers that entire Central Arctic Ocean area. So they have the scientific expertise as well. The other important thing is that you would have involvement of the United States, because as I said, they're not signatories to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they are very unlikely to sign the High Seas Treaty. But they are involved with the Arctic Council, so they might actually accept this high seas protected area that is driven through the Arctic Council. And that's important because of Article 23.4 of the High Seas Treaty, which is the opt-out. I do think that, if you're going to have it work, you've got to make sure that those 5 states are in. If the United States opts out, that's going to make it very difficult to have a successful high seas marine protected area. So where this would be, in my vision, we have already in Canada this Arctic Marine Protected Area. It is not complete yet because of COVID. Things got pushed back a bit, but this is in the last ice area. The last ice area is the area that will still have ice after most of the Arctic is already ice free. And it covers almost 320,000 kilometers. It's the oldest and thickest ice, and it is very important for ice-dependent species, and it has a very diverse and abundant seabed community. And what's interesting about it is that the protected area goes all the way to the seabed and goes 5 meters below as well. That is a whole separate presentation that I would need to do to explain the importance of that. But what you can see is that it stops very abruptly at the exclusive economic zone. And what we know is that legal boundaries very rarely actually correspond with ecological boundaries. So this is an artificial stop in a marine protected area. So what I would like to see, and we're going to see if this works. We'll make it big. So this map here, this is put out by the WWF. And I will show first, we have the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, which is also the Central Arctic Ocean. But and we've got the different maritime zones of all the Arctic states. So you can see that. Again, it corresponds with the area that is the Central Arctic Ocean beyond the exclusive economic zones. But what's important is the WWF has put together some priority areas that they think need to be protected, and those are in green. And you'll notice that we had the marine protected area from Canada, and then there's a part that juts right out, and I want to show, that goes up, and there's the North Pole right there. This corresponds with the last ice area, and it would be a perfect location to have a High Seas Marine Protected Area, just an extension of what Canada's already put together. We have a lot of the science already in place. And what's key to this is that area is the area that is contested by Russia, Denmark, and Canada. I think it's very unlikely that they'll come to an agreement on who owns what, which means it will always be in limbo and perhaps not protected. That North Pole really captures the international imagination, and for Russia and Canada in particular, the Arctic is a huge part of their identity. So you could imagine it would be difficult to concede to another country, but perhaps you could concede it to a high seas marine protected area that involves scientific cooperation and a peace zone, as we're seeing massive militarization. Let's see if I can get back to there we go. So, as I'd like to conclude, we have a number of countries that are trying to get a piece of the Arctic, mainly for the resources, but it would be nice to shift towards peace in the Arctic. In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader, said that he would let the north of the globe, the Arctic, become a zone of peace. This was the catalyst that started the creation of the Arctic Council and almost 30 years of cooperation with those states. And it would be great to recapture that going forward as we see a lot of tension. Thank you.